on to our own region in the Asia Pacific. Do you think that China and the US are engaged in a kind of a battle for primacy, or is the Chinese response largely being reactive to the US desire to still be top dog? And in that context, I mean, China feels the West has abandoned preventive diplomacy and conflict prevention as stoking fear to justify coercive diplomacy and military containment. And then their argument about that is that it's all reflected in the Quad, the Indo-Pacific Four, which includes Australia, Japan, South Korea, and New Zealand, NATO's Asia expansion, and AUKUS. Can you tell us why you oppose these agreements, and what would you do about them if you're still Prime Minister?
Well, wouldn't be in them is a short answer. So, I mean, clearly the US has an interest in continuing to be what has been the sole superpower for quite a long time. And that's kind of natural when you think about it, that they would want that. I think the insights we got from Professor Hugh White's visit a couple of months ago is that the US is not investing nearly enough to make that remotely a possibility in the West Pacific. And he contrasted the levels of military expenditure during the Cold War with what the US spends today. And his thesis was that while the goal may be to keep military primacy in the West Pacific, it can't do it. On the other hand, you have China, which is a rising power, fast rising power, and has its own ambitions. So somehow I think countries like New Zealand need to be thinking about how we position. I think Hugh White was right to say that it's more important than ever to have a good relationship with ASEAN as a bloc and look at how it navigates between blocs. I mean, we're in an interesting situation. We're probably the most isolated Western country geographically. It's quite clear where the value system of New Zealand is, but we also have to make a living, and like the majority of the world's countries, making a living has quite a dependence on China. There's nothing unique about that. So the last thing we need is outright conflict between the two of them, nor do we need the Western world decoupling its economy from China, which would be catastrophic for us, but it would be catastrophic for most countries, by the way. Let's not think that decoupling Western economies from China is going to be a very successful enterprise, because the bulk of the world is not Western countries. Population is actually quite small. The dynamism's somewhere else. And you need to be positioned as a small trading economy to be able to prosper geographically broadly. So I think there is some serious thinking to be done about the course New Zealand has pitched itself on at the moment, which I do not agree with. When you see in official briefings, and I have seen one which is shortly to be released, New Zealand is, quote, in strategic alignment with the United States. I haven't seen that in a briefing paper in my time. I mean, we have differences. We also have some agreement. We've been able to work issue by issue, but the lineup of strategic alignment, invoking the ANZUS Treaty again, which we were thrown out of operation and involved with close to 4 decades ago, going from exploring the possibilities of AUKUS Pillar 2 to seeing good reason to engage with it, which was the Blinken-Peters statement of recent months. You now see New Zealand's sole Navy tanker acting as a force multiplier for the Royal Australian Navy, trundling through the Straits of Taiwan. Hello. Presumably, I don't know whether it's the only Royal New Zealand Navy participation in the West Philippine Sea exercise, but someone's there from the Navy. I mean, what are we trying to do here? It's beyond me. So I think our positioning is actually quite damaging to the independent stance that we've had. I mean, linking also back to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, what on earth are we doing supporting the bombing of the Houthis in Yemen? I've been to Yemen in my time at UNDP. The Houthis controlled the north of the country then. They now pretty much control all of it. Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates have been bombing it for the last 8 years and have had no impact on Houthi control whatsoever, and nor will the odd bombing raid led by a US coalition backed by New Zealand. I mean, why not deal with their core issue, which is what's happening in Gaza? You know, the Houthis won't be blocking straits if the Gaza and Palestinian-Israeli issues are resolved. So I think we really need to be back to seeing New Zealand as a small country that's acting on the basis of international law and wanting peaceful conflict to resolution to conflict, rather than, you know, being the, you know, like some kind of, you know, Prussians of the Pacific rushing in wherever we see a fight.
So when you were Prime Minister, you focused a lot of attention on the Pacific and on New Zealand's independent foreign policy, and you hoped that would be bipartisan and based on New Zealand's distinctive national identity and so forth. Given our sort of now continuing expanding security entanglement with Australia and the US and Asian allies and even NATO, what does an independent foreign policy look like in 2024? Can you point to things that you did as Prime Minister where you asserted our independence even with these entanglements? Well,
the only sort of active formal alliance we have is with Australia under the closer defence relationship, but that really doesn't take us past, you know, the Australia-New Zealand framing, in my opinion. I mean, New Zealand's independent foreign policy has been asserted in a number of ways, obviously in the decision not to have a bar of the invasion of Iraq, which is one of the most sensible things we ever did. And, you know, going back to, you know, the nuclear weapons-free zone here, support for in the Pacific and more widely, this is all important. I think if we were looking for, you know, new ways to play a role, we should re-energise our work on nuclear disarmament. I think we could also look at other areas which are not sufficiently governed in the arms area. For example, the Biological Weapons Treaty is quite weak, and definitely in, you know, what we now fear around weakness of biosecurity regulation, etc. That could do with strengthening. There's areas of warfare around the use of artificial intelligence, drones, etc., which are just ungoverned. And I think, you know, New Zealand could make a mark as a country interested in trying to, you know, reconstruct an effective weapons control infrastructure. Let's also not acknowledge that some of the weapons control infrastructure, for example, in Europe, has been dismantled by the Trump-Putin era and continues to be under huge strain. So I would like to see us, you know, really step up more in this area, and I don't see why that couldn't be a bipartisan endeavour.
In that regard, why do you think that the New Zealand peace movement is so relatively quiescent at the moment, as are the peace movements all around the world? I mean, we were shocked into action in the 70s and 80s, but you know, it seems to me that without some sort of civil society impetus, that focus on weapons of mass destruction and so forth will remain in the balance.
So if you go back to the 70s and 80s, when the Cold War was at its height, I think there was quite a widespread awareness in New Zealand that while we were very unlikely to be the target of a nuclear weapon, nonetheless, if the Northern Hemisphere wiped itself out, life would change for us very significantly. No getting on the plane to London or Los Angeles, you know, who are you going to sell to? You know, just everything changed. And so you saw that incredible movement of the neighbourhood peace groups that sprung up across New Zealand when I became the MP for Mount Albert. The Mount Albert, you know, nuclear-free community group. I mean, this was just one of, I'd say, dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, across New Zealand. And so when that Cold War came to an end for a brief period. Maybe the movement hung up its boots a bit, thought the job had been done, but it's not done. It's not done at all. I mean, we're seeing nuclear weapon use threatened in the Ukraine war conflict. And then, with these other devastating conflicts like Israel, Gaza, Sudan, Myanmar, etc., I think with the pandemic, New Zealand looked very inward. We were locked down, we were preoccupied with our own issues. And now, since then, people have been pretty down to it with the cost of living crisis, and now, what's going on politically here, which, in a way sees the government, assaulting just about every social sector except the wealthiest. So people are kind of down to it, and to ask them to look outwards again, it's not an easy ask in the context, but I think that those who care about it have to keep raising the issues and saying, New Zealand's reputation's on the line here as a small country that has stood for more peaceful conflict resolution and a nuclear-free world and so on and so forth.
And finally, we've got only a few minutes to go. We can't stop without considering the whole question of climate change. Since 2023 was the hottest year for 174 years, the 22nd of July this year was the world's warmest day in recorded history. Antarctic and Arctic winters are warming. The 1.5% limit certainly be exceeded. The Stockholm Resilience Centre concluded that 6 of its 9 planetary boundaries have been breached in terms of levels of pollution of air, soil, sea, and fresh water, and loss of biodiversity. What do you think about the current government's position in relation to the environment? And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade have said that if they persist in dismantling a lot of our environmental regulations, that's going to pose huge reputational damage to New Zealand. What would you do if you were in Luxon's seat?
Well, I think it's very unfortunate that they are dismantling some of the architecture which was put in place before, and I think James Shaw did a terrific job as the climate minister in the government led by Jacinda and then by Chris Hipkins. It took a long time to get the Climate Change Commission in place, but the idea was to try and get a broad consensus about how we'd move forward. But it's not enough just to have a consensus around that architecture. You have to then put flesh on the bones, and our farming community does have some issues to address. A fossil fuel-based power future is not where we want to be. If any country can be fully renewable, it's New Zealand. We're in a good rain year, we're 80% renewable now. Lake Onslow pumped hydro would have helped secure that future as well, and that's gone down the proverbial drain. So I think it's going to be very problematic what happens with greenhouse gas emissions here now. We're not on a trajectory to meet any sensible target. And I think it will also be quite damaging for New Zealand and the South Pacific, because I can say, having sat at 9 Pacific Island Forum leaders' meetings, 8 of them with John Howard as Australian Prime Minister, we were never the target of anger, he was. Kevin Rudd came along and climate was a priority for him, and that changed. But now, New Zealand will be seen as not acting on what is seen by the Pacific as an existential threat, which is climate change. And they want to see their major metropolitan partners, Australia and New Zealand, acting on this. Needless to say, when the climate change conference comes around this year, which it will in yet another petrodollar state, no doubt New Zealand will also get Fossil of the Day award, as we did last year, for what's not happening on climate action. So, we're not pulling our weight. Last time I looked, New Zealand had about the 5th highest level of emissions in the OECD, which is not good. And we're quite, per capita, we're quite significant globally. So our reputation is not what it could be.
This is the time to end, and before I do so, I want to thank you, Helen, for your wisdom and sharing your experiences with it. And since this meeting has been organized by SGI, I want to finish with a quote from your president, Daisaku Ikeda, who said, "Hope transforms pessimism into optimism. Hope is invincible. Hope changes everything. It changes winter into summer, darkness into dawn, descent into ascent, barrenness into creativity, agony into joy. Hope is the sun, its light, its passion. It's the fundamental force for life's blossoming. And when we change, the world changes. The key to all change is in our inner transformation, a change of our hearts and minds. This is human revolution. We have all the power to change. When we realize this truth, we can bring forth that power anywhere, anytime, and in any situation. So the onus is on you and me and all of us to begin from where we are in order to transform ourselves and to begin that terrible transformation of the entire world. And I want to thank you personally, Helen, for your work and commitment on all of these peace, justice, sustainability issues over the years. You've been a sterling example to all of us, and I'm pleased to have counted you a friend for 50 years.